美国第60届总统选举预计在2024年11月5日举行投票，精彩可期的候选人辩论，在美国总统辩论委员会的规划里，分别要在9月16日、10月1日以及10月9日举行。可是拜登的竞选总部在5月就提出不参加这3场辩论，还主动提议把3场辩论缩短成2场，分别要在6月跟9月举行。然后6月27日，这场拜登跟川普的电视辩论会，没有想到竟成了拜登在这次参选中最大的遗憾。就在美国各大媒体关心的话题围绕在拜登退不退选之际，全世界已经开始忧心 trumponomics 2.0 带来的杀伤力。加上7月8日，共和党率先抛出16页完全以美国内政为主的2024年党纲草案来看，川普已经做好完胜的准备，任何一个阻挡他重回白宫的大石头，他都会搬开。
As the New York Times puts it today, the Republican platform could read like a Trump rally. It's a document that reads less like a list of policy proposals and more like the teleprompter at a Trump rally. The Washington Post describing it as, quote, a full Trump takeover of the party. The platform promises the mass deportations of millions and proposes ending the Department of Education, echoing several of the pillars of another conservative roadmap, the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. These policies are so alarming to most Americans that Donald Trump has sought to distance himself from Project 2025 in recent days.
The Republican National Committee has now put out its platform with Donald Trump apparently personally writing portions of it. And what's interesting is how Trump's role ended up moderating certain contentious policy issues for the Republican Party. But I actually think it was a smart political move because the extremists in the Republican Party were actually pushing for loser policy ideas. And I think Trump, to his credit, realizes, oh, this is actually going to hurt the chances of Republicans winning congressional races and potentially Donald Trump himself in the general election, although, Democrats decided to provide cover for Biden, who is now very likely going to lose to Trump if he stays in the race. Now, with that in mind, the document was apparently chopped down from 66 pages in 2016 to just 16 pages this year. And some are in fact complaining that it was developed behind closed doors and approved by delegates in just a few hours Monday morning. Now, some prominent rank and file evangelicals criticized the language for backpedaling on the GOP's longstanding promise to ban abortions nationally. But to be fair, I mean, Trump has said repeatedly on national television publicly that he's not going to push for a national abortion ban, not because of his principles, but because he realizes it's a big loser for Republicans. That's the main reason why Republicans didn't have such a massive red wave during the midterms. And so he learned a lesson from that and is trying to moderate the Republicans' messaging on that. But evangelicals, especially evangelical leaders like Tony Perkins, not happy about this.
I know Trump's a con man. Nobody's talked more about what a con man he is than I have. And I know that the scary parts of that he might actually do, the parts where he protects Social Security and Medicare, not necessarily so. But as you read the document from an analysis point of view, I thought this is going to be fairly effective. And he's taken out most of the crazy radical stuff and the stuff that isn't popular.
不管共和党2024年党纲草案内容是简洁扼要，还是像造势场上的提词器，至少他明确地告诉全世界，川普重回白宫后会重内政轻外交，不属于美国的战争一律保持距离，除非有利可图。至于川普挂在嘴边最爱说的关税，对于交易型的领导人来说，那是谈判桌上的武器，在通往 Mega 的大道上，不用的人才是笨蛋。至于要怎么用才能用得巧妙，经济学家看的层面比较广，但投资管理公司则是相对担忧。
Yes, it is. Of course, Democrats and Republicans want to be tough on China, but Biden administration had a view of creating what they call a narrow yard with high fences and concentrating on some critical technological factors and sanctions, while the plan of Trump, at least at face value, is one of imposing a 10% tariff on all the imports coming to the United States, even from friends and allies like Europe Japan, South Korea, you name it, and up to 60% on Chinese goods. So I would say that the big question mark is going to be whether it's going to head and do that, or whether it's going to offer some carrots and sticks, telling, for example, Europeans that if they spend more on defense or if they change some of their trade policies, they may be subject to exemption from the 10% tariff. Same thing for China. It may gradually increase the tariffs every month to reach eventually 60%, but if China does certain things, maybe it stops short of that. But the point is that any tariff is a regressive form of taxation. It increases import prices, and it causes a higher inflation.
Let's wrap in Fed risk and political risk into one question, because I was reading a note from Goldman saying that the risk of Trump being reelected and putting in place some of those tariffs that he's talked about, it could lead to 5 extra Fed hikes. So not talking about cuts there. And when you think about all the known unknowns that are out there, especially as it relates to politics right now, are you hedging for any risk of something like that scenario playing out?
Yeah, I think you have to be really thoughtful because there's so much political risk going on. And the shift generally you're seeing across the world is kind of dissatisfaction with the people in power, populism in many cases continuing to be on the rise. And a Trump versus Biden or Trump versus whoever the Democratic nominee ends up being is very significant change in policy. One of the more significant elections. It'll probably happen very quickly, just like there was the significant corporate tax cut when Trump came in before. He's coming in ready with tariffs. That's the big first thing. The second thing will be the continuation of the tax cuts. All of this move towards populism is pointing towards a continuation of more government deficits, probably more inflation, tariffs, at least in the short run and probably in the long run. Our view would be that they're inflationary. And a Trump presidency, the thing that we'd kind of most be concerned about is the long end of the rate curve. Probably bond yields, Fed, they'll try to get an easy Fed in and probably have the most significant challenges on the long end of the yield curve in terms of bonds. But those policy changes are going to be significant. And if you look at basically just understanding global macroeconomics today versus 25 years ago, understanding government interaction with markets has become so critical.
Right. How do you then position, if you believe inflation is in the future, do you go short the long end of the curve, and do you do it significantly?
Well, we try to take a diversified set of positions so that no one position can be too dominant in our portfolio. But it's tricky, right? The long end of the yield curve, a lot's going to depend on politics, right? And a lot's going to depend on how unified the government is. Will Trump be able to get everything he wants, or if the Democrats are elected, will they be able to get everything they want? Divided government will generally be good for bonds, and a unified government, one way or the other, Republican or Democrat, would probably be bad. Anytime these governments are unified right now, you're seeing movements towards populism, movements toward bigger deficit spending. And we think that's the more likely outcome, is that you continue down that path. But there's a lot of change along the way. And in the short run, what's going to matter is Fed policy. And is the Fed constrained? We think the Fed's itching to ease. They want to essentially have the stats come in a way that allows them to, and we're close to that. They probably
need to, right? With $100 billion plus of debt servicing costs every month, we need rates to be lower. At what point does this massive debt and the servicing costs really start to become a problem for, the 10-year yield or the strength of the dollar?
Well, and that's what I think we're going to find out. Right. What you can see right now is there's not much risk premium in long duration bonds. There hasn't been a problem. That doesn't mean there won't be. Right. And I think the main thing I'd say is the destiny here is that governments are going to push until we hit the limits. Right. You see that in countries like Brazil or whatever, where they're at the point where fiscal spending hits the limits. You saw that for a brief moment in 2022 with the UK.
The Liz Truss moment.
Liz Truss moment. But in the U.S., you're still probably a ways away. But I think the destiny of it, because of the populism and sort of the amount of things that need to be fixed in the U.S., the likelihood is we find that. Now, I would guess that's a couple years away, but that we'll continue to press in the direction until we find the limit, that easing fiscally will continue to be the path until that limit is hit.
Until the bond vigilantes come back.
Yeah, and it won't be, speculators are too small, relative to what's going on. It's really the Fed and and generally the size of that issuance. And so what is going to be the limit is inflation. If there's no inflation problem, there won't be a problem for bonds. It won't come from anything other than inflation currency problem.
不论2025年的白宫主人是谁，重振美国经济、整顿美国债务都会是首要之务。因此，有人预测，川普回任后想要削减庞大的美国财政赤字，单凭万税可能力道不足，所以断开跟乌克兰的锁链，跟普丁谈好交易，把重建乌克兰的包袱甩给欧盟，接更多来自世界的军火武器订单。种种臆测在小道上蔓延。
When I asked you about former President Trump, you plan on meeting him to prepare for potentially if he's president of the United States?
Yeah. I said, yes. I said that I'm potentially ready to meet with President Trump. Of course, for me, it's very important. So for me, it's very important not to have any surprises, which can be very tragical, yeah, in English, tragiczny, yeah, very tragic to Ukraine. I mean, that I don't want to have any surprise. I want to understand what he means when he said or when he says or when his team, maybe it's not him, maybe some circle, his close circle. I don't know these people. I mean, that I said to you that I knew a lot of people from when he was the president. Yes, so I don't know his close persons, not too much about it.
But are there plans in the works?
They can't. I mean, they can't plan my life and life of our people and our children, etc. That's why I'm not pushing to. I'm just, my message is if they have the plan, it can be maybe not public because of the elections, but I think we have to know it before to prepare.
He also said at the debate that it was Putin's dream to do this, and he said he told me about it. Had he ever told you?
About what?
Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
No, Trump?
Trump said Putin saw what happened in Afghanistan, and then he took that moment and said, I'm going to go in, invade Ukraine. And Trump said this was his dream. He told me about it, his dream. When Trump was president, did he ever relay that information to you?
No, I think yes, it's true. I think it's true. Maybe it's not. I think it's true, yeah, that it was Putin's dream to occupy Ukraine.
То, что господин Трамп, как кандидат в президенты, заявляет о том, что он готов и хочет остановить войну на Украине, мы к этому относимся вполне серьезно. Я не знаком, разумеется, с его возможными предложениями по поводу того, как он собирается это сделать. И это, конечно, ключевой вопрос. Но я не сомневаюсь, что он говорит это искренне, и мы это поддержим.
令世界各国感到不安的还有 trumponomics 2.0 是否会引爆更大规模的货币战争与更难应对的通货膨胀。当美国与沙烏地阿拉伯的石油美元协议到期且不再续约，当美元作为世界主要储备货币跌到14年来的最低点，一股潜在的危机也正在慢慢酝酿。
Is the reign of the US dollar in global trade under an existential threat? This may well be the case because a critical decades-long deal between Saudi Arabia and the US, known as the petrodollar deal, expired on June 8. The deal was originally signed on June 8, 1974. Through it, the US agreed to buy oil from Saudi Arabia in exchange for military aid and equipment, while the Saudis would invest their petrodollar revenue back into the US economy. In other words, petrodollars are US dollars in exchange for crude oil exports. The expiry of the deal now allows Saudi Arabia to sell its oil in multiple different currencies, such as the Chinese renminbi and yuan, the euro and the British pound, as well as cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. Vital to the US's global economic influence, the expiry or the collapse of the deal is expected to impact the US dollar value and its dominance in global trade, as experts now also predict that Saudi Arabia is intending to end its association with USD following its entry into BRICS. which seeks to prioritize trade in local currencies. With Russia and Saudi Arabia now vying to move away from trading in USD, will the global dominance of the dollar, which is still the most dominant currency in the world, be coming to an end?
Now, the Saudis, it seems, have let this 50-year-long petrodollar agreement lapse. They haven't renewed it. It doesn't look like they will. Now, this is super important because part of what keeps the dollar as the global reserve currency has been its status as the petrodollar, meaning that oil could only be purchased using dollars. So what happens when people stop using the dollar for oil? What happens globally, and what happens to people here in the US with dollars?
Well, ultimately, it loses value. I mean, the theory really would be that as those dollars, there are way more dollars outside the U.S. than are inside the U.S. because of the stockpiling to buy oil for 50 years. And as those dollars come home and are sold back to the issuer because no one wants to hold them anymore. Now, it hasn't turned out into a full-fledged dumping, which I could see it turning into that at some point. But there still is demand for the dollar. But little by little by little, I call it logarithmic decay. Little by little by little by little, it starts to chip away as those dollars are there's no longer a necessity to hold them. And as those dollars start to come home, inflation rates would go higher and higher and higher and higher. And that's the big thing that I've always talked about, is that Powell doesn't want to raise rates, doesn't want to let the 10-year Treasury get above 5% because of the over-leveraged system, in particular the banks and the broker or the insurance companies that are massively over-leveraged and undercapitalized. And as rates rise, and supposedly this magic number is at 5% on the 10-year Treasury, things start to break. Now, if all of a sudden the world is no longer holding dollars and in fact forsaking and dumping them and throwing them back to the issuer, creating much, much higher inflation than the CPI would probably tell us, the market would demand a higher interest rate to compensate for that loss of purchasing power. You can't have double-digit inflation and single-digit interest rates. Your currency dies. So interest rates would rise to meet that loss in purchasing power, to compensate for that. And when that happens, that's when you start to get into problems where, as rates rise, things that in this country that make people feel wealthy, their stock holdings, their bond holdings, their real estate holdings, and the money held in the bank are all inversely correlated to that moment. And the over-leveraging of the banks in particular is a real big problem here. The dollar would collapse, the stock market would collapse, the bond market would collapse, banking system would collapse, the insurance companies would collapse, everything. This is the Great Reset. Could it happen? I don't know. I hope not. But I think that we will see a progression, a continued progression of de-dollarization, de-treasurization that we have seen accelerate over the last few years. It's not stopping. The question is, how fast does it accelerate? And that's anyone's guess.